The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was not the soothing melody of the string quartet or the shimmer of crystal chandeliers. It was the thick, unmistakable scent of unearned arrogance. At table 3, right near the center stage of the annual corporate gala, the atmosphere was dense with high-stakes pretense. Crystal glasses clinked softly, professional photographers flashed their heavy lenses, and sycophantic conversations flowed like cheap champagne. But right where I sat, the world felt steady and remarkably quiet. My name is Julian Vance. I am 51 years old, and I was sitting exactly where I was supposed to be sitting, at least according to the heavy gold-embossed invitation in my breast pocket and the $1.3 billion capital restructuring commitment idling securely on my encrypted tablet. Sitting to my right was Clara Miller, my chief executive assistant, who was reviewing the final compliance checklist before the signing ceremony scheduled for 9 that evening. Clara glanced nervously toward the main entrance. "They are staring at us, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient chatter of the room. "Let them stare, Clara," I replied calmly, unfolding my linen napkin and placing it neatly across my lap. The brass place card directly in front of my plate was crisp and clear. It bore my full name in bold lettering, Julian Vance. Managing partner, Vance Capital Partners. Then he arrived. Brandon Thorne, the 28-year-old sole heir to Thorne Holdings, walked over with the heavy gait of a young man who believed the entire world had been constructed solely for his personal entertainment. Trailing behind him was a young woman dripping in diamonds, wearing a silk gown that probably cost more than an average employee annual salary, holding a glass of vintage wine and looking as though she had never heard the word no in her entire life. Brandon did not greet anyone. He did not check the seating chart on the pedestal nearby. He simply approached table 3, tapped his manicured fingers sharply against the polished mahogany, and looked down at me with cold contempt. "This seat is taken, old man," Brandon said, his voice carrying clearly across the surrounding tables. I did not look up immediately. I carefully placed my silver water goblet back onto the white tablecloth before turning my head. "You are mistaken, young man. I am sitting in it." Brandon let out a dry, theatrical chuckle that drew instant attention from neighboring executives. "Well, you need to get up. It is reserved for my girlfriend, Tiffany. You should head down to the general guest section near the back exit." "Ma'am, sir, whatever you want to call yourself." Before Clara or I could speak, Brandon reached down, grabbed my custom place card, and casually flicked it off the table. The heavy brass card clattered onto the hardwood floor. Then, with a slow, deliberate twist of his polished leather shoe, Brandon stomped directly on top of it, grinding the metal face into the dusty wood. He did not apologize. He did not blink. He simply pulled out the heavy velvet chair for Tiffany. As if I were nothing more than invisible smoke, Clara stood up so fast, her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Excuse me, sir. Do you have any idea who this is?" Brandon ignored her completely, wrapping an arm around Tiffany's waist and whispering something into her ear that made her giggle. Around us, the polite murmurs of the gala ground to a sudden halt. The rhythmic clinking of silverware stopped. Nearby guests turned their heads, and within seconds, smartphones were raised across adjacent tables. Digital lenses tilted toward our table, capturing every frame of the unfolding spectacle. I leaned down slowly, picked up the scuffed place card from beneath his shoe, wiped the dust off the brass surface with my thumb, and laid it back on the white tablecloth. Then I stood up to my full height, looking Brandon directly in his eyes. My voice was quiet, steady, and devoid of any anger. "You should not have done that, Brandon." Brandon burst into a loud, mocking laugh that echoed toward the stage. "What are you going to do about it? Call venue security? This is my family company party. My mother owns this entire enterprise. What you just did," I said, raising my voice just enough for the recording phones to catch every syllable, "just cost your mother exactly $1.3 billion. A brief flicker of confusion crossed Brandon's face, but it vanished instantly, replaced by a sneer of pure amusement. $1.3 billion? Right. Let us get my mother down here right now. She will love explaining your place in this city." Clara tugged gently at my sleeve, her face pale. "Julian, maybe we should step outside and call legal counsel." I stayed silent. The surrounding crowd was holding its breath, eager to see how far this public humiliation would escalate. Brandon pulled out his phone, hit speakerphone, and dialed a direct line. "Mom, get down to table 3 right now. There is some stubborn middle-aged guy squatting in Tiffany VIP seat and making absurd financial threats." The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically even before Eleanor Thorne, the chief executive officer of Thorne Holdings, made her appearance. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Eleanor walked through, her red velvet gown trailing behind her, carrying the cold aura of an executive who believed she was untouchable. "What is going on here, Brandon?" Eleanor asked, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. Brandon pointed a finger at my chest. "This man is ruining our evening, Mother. He refused to vacate Tiffany's seat and claimed he is an investor." Eleanor turned her gaze toward me. Her inspection was rapid, arrogant, and utterly superficial. She did not bother to read the place card on the table, nor did she recognize my face, despite having sent 3 personal invitation letters to my office over the preceding month. "I am afraid this section is reserved exclusively for confirmed institutional partners and honored guests," Eleanor said in a cold, practiced tone. "Security, please escort this gentleman out through the service door immediately so we do not disrupt the opening remarks." Clara stepped forward, holding up our credentials. "Mrs. Thorne, we have an official executive invitation issued directly by your corporate board." Eleanor merely held up a single gloved hand, cutting Clara off without another word. 2 imposing security guards moved in from the perimeter, stepping up to my sides. Brandon smirked triumphantly as he pulled out the velvet chair once more. "Sit down, babe. The trash has been cleared away." Tiffany sat down with a satisfied smile, adjusting her necklace. Surrounding guests whispered among themselves, assuming I was some delusional intruder who had snuck past the registration desk. I did not resist when the security guard reached out to touch my elbow. I simply stood straight, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, and looked Eleanor dead in the eye. "You will not remember this evening the way you think you will, Eleanor," I said softly. "You will remember it as the exact minute you lost control of Thorne Holdings." Eleanor did not bother to reply. In her mind, I was already a discarded nonentity. I turned on my heel and walked out of the grand ballroom. Clara followed closely behind, her fingers trembling as she clutched her tablet. Behind us, the string quartet resumed playing, and glasses clinked once more as if no harm had been done. But it was a fragile illusion. When I walked out of those golden double doors, I did not just leave a party. I took the financial lifeline of Thorne Holdings with me. Spencer Montgomery, the chief investment officer of Montgomery Capital, should have been standing at table 3 to prevent the disaster. Instead, he was trapped in heavy gridlock traffic 6 blocks away, watching the rain streak down his windshield while sweat beaded along his forehead. Spencer was not just an invited guest. He was the primary liaison managing the institutional syndicate that held 40% of Thorne Holdings' debt maturities, and he was one of the few executives in the city who knew exactly what Julian Vance looked like. Spencer's phone chimed repeatedly on the dashboard. He grabbed the device and hit redial for the 5th time. "Pick up the phone, Eleanor, or Brandon, somebody pick up," he muttered furiously. Finally, an executive assistant answered the line. "Hello, Spencer. The gala is moving along wonderfully. Has Mr. Vance arrived yet?" Spencer cut her off instantly. "Forget the pleasantries. Is Julian Vance in the ballroom? Is he at table 3? "Oh," the assistant replied nonchalantly. "There was a minor incident at table 3 earlier. Some middle-aged man was causing a commotion over seating, but Mrs. Thorne and Brandon had security escort him out. Everything is under control now." Spencer's blood ran completely cold. His hands froze on the steering wheel. "Who did you say was escorted out?" Before the assistant could answer, Spencer's phone vibrated violently with an automated system notification from Vance Capital Global Treasury Portal. A priority transaction freeze alert flashed in bright red letters across his screen. Transaction status: $1.3 billion credit facility and equity restructuring agreement canceled. Reason for termination: material breach of partner respect protocols and corporate ethics covenants under Master Agreement Clause 9. "Turn the car around," Spencer screamed at his driver, his voice cracking with panic. "Do not go to the hotel. Take me directly to Vance Capital headquarters." Back inside the grand ballroom, Brandon Thorne was sipping 50-year-old scotch, completely oblivious to the fact that every drop of liquid in his glass represented millions of dollars his family company could no longer afford to spend. He had no idea that when Julian Vance walked out of the building, the $1.3 billion capital injection listed on Thorne Holdings' prospective balance sheet had evaporated into thin air. By 8:30 the next morning, the executive floor at Thorne Holdings' corporate headquarters in Manhattan was quiet, but the air felt heavy. Eleanor Thorne sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, holding her morning espresso with absolute confidence. During the morning executive briefing, she dismissed the previous night incident with a breezy wave of her hand. It was nothing more than a minor misunderstanding with an uninvited attendee, Eleanor declared, her voice firm and authoritative. Nothing that impacts our macro strategy or our pending capital closing. No one around the table dared to question the chief executive officer. On paper, the promised $1.3 billion transaction was still listed as pending final execution, shimmering like a guarantee of endless corporate expansion. Brandon, who sat at the end of the table, as the newly appointed vice president of business operations, made no effort to conceal his arrogance. I overheard him talking on his personal phone in the hallway right after the meeting. "It is all taken care of, Tiffany. Some old guy thought he could flex his ego at our gala, so Mom had security dump him on the sidewalk. He is history." He believed the man's disappearance was the end of the chapter. But in top-tier private equity, when an institutional titan goes silent, it is not a retreat. It is the tactical silence that precedes a complete annihilation. Down in the chief financial officer office on the 14th floor, there was no laughter. The CFO stared at his double monitors, his forehead dripping with sweat. We were scheduled to receive the preliminary disbursement clearance code from Vance Capital. At 7 this morning, he stammered to his senior controller. "Where is the verification token?" The controller shook his head nervously. "Their bank wire queue is empty. I called their treasury desk 4 times, but all calls are routing directly to automated voicemail. In business, a 5-minute delay during a major closing is stressful. A 3-hour radio silence without explanation is an unannounced execution." Over at Vance Capital headquarters, I sat in my corner office on the 45th floor, looking out over the city skyline. Clara stood beside my desk, handing me a freshly printed legal brief. Spencer Montgomery had been waiting in our lobby for over 2 hours, begging for a 5-minute meeting. "Shall I let him in?" Clara asked quietly. "Not yet, Clara," I said, taking a sip of black coffee. "Let Spencer wait. And make sure our legal team files the formal notice of covenant default with the SEC filing desk by noon." Meanwhile, Spencer was pacing back and forth in our glass lobby, his face pale. He pulled out his phone and called Eleanor directly. When she finally picked up, her voice sounded annoyed. "Spencer, why are you calling my personal line? We are preparing for the afternoon press conference." "Eleanor, listen to me very carefully," Spencer said, his voice shaking so hard he could barely articulate the words. "Who did you kick out of table 3 last night?" "I told you, it was an arrogant intruder," Eleanor replied coldly. "Eleanor," Spencer yelled, ignoring all professional decorum. "That man was Julian Vance, managing partner of Vance Capital, the man who personally signed off on your $1.3 billion restructuring loan." The line went dead silent. For 5 long seconds, the only sound on the phone was the faint hum of Eleanor's office air conditioning. "What did you just say?" Eleanor whispered, her voice suddenly devoid of all confidence. "He was the investor, Eleanor," Spencer said, "and right now, he has frozen the entire capital pool. Your company has $80 million in short-term debt maturing in less than 15 days, and without Vance Capital backing, your debt ratio triggers an immediate technical default." Before Eleanor could process the horror of what she was hearing, a private internal email began circulating rapidly among the senior board members and major institutional shareholders of Thorne Holdings. Attached to the email was a crisp, high-definition video file recorded on a smartphone at the gala. The video showed Table 3 in vivid detail. Brandon's arrogant voice rang through the speakers. "You should head to the general guest section, old man." The camera zoomed in as Brandon grabbed the place card marked Julian Vance, tossed it onto the floor, and deliberately ground his heel into it. Then the footage showed Eleanor arriving, refusing to listen to Clara, and directing security guards to haul Julian out like a criminal. The video ended with Julian's calm, piercing declaration. "What you just did just cost your mother exactly $1.3 billion. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. The video did not require commentary or spin. It provided absolute, indisputable proof of a corporate leadership team consumed by unbridled vanity and gross incompetence. Within 45 minutes, the video had been forwarded to every major investment bank on Wall Street. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the quiet panic inside Thorn Holdings had exploded into an outright emergency. The corporate headquarters was in chaos. Executive phones were ringing off their hooks, board members were demanding emergency video conferences, and news of the canceled transaction had leaked to financial news outlets. Inside Eleanor Executive Suite, Brandon was pacing back and forth, his previous composure entirely shattered. "This is insane!" Brandon shouted, slamming his fist onto the marble coffee table. "So he is some rich guy with hurt feelings. We can just hire another investment bank. There are dozens of funds in New York." "Shut your mouth, Brandon," Eleanor snapped, her face pale as ash. "You have no idea what you have done." She was right. Brandon had no understanding of modern corporate law or debt architecture. Vance Capital was not merely a passive lender. They were the master licensor of the core technology architecture that Thorn Holdings relied upon for its primary manufacturing operations. 20 minutes later, my chief legal counsel, Arthur Vance, along with Clara, walked into the main boardroom of Thorn Holdings. Eleanor, Brandon, and 4 terrified board members were waiting. Eleanor attempted to maintain a professional facade as she stood up to greet my legal team. "Mr. Vance," Eleanor said, her voice strained, "we deeply regret the misunderstanding at the gala last night. Brandon was overzealous, and I was misinformed. We are prepared to offer a formal public apology to Mr. Julian Vance and grant him permanent honorary seats on our executive advisory board." Arthur Vance did not sit down. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, placed a thick black leather portfolio on the table, and looked at Eleanor with cold legal detachment. "Mrs. Thorn, I am not here to accept apologies," Arthur stated clearly. "I am here to deliver formal legal notices regarding your company near breaches of federal statutory law and contractual covenants." Arthur opened the portfolio and slid the first document across the table. First, under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, Vance Capital is exercising its statutory right to terminate all proprietary software and patent licensing agreements granted to Thorn Holdings, effective at midnight tonight. Your primary manufacturing line utilizes our patented automated control algorithms. Continued operation past midnight will constitute willful patent and copyright infringement under federal law, subjecting your company to statutory damages of up to $150,000 per day per violation. Eleanor stared at the document, her hands trembling. "You cannot just cut off our production licenses. That will halt 70% of our revenue stream." "We can, and we have," Arthur replied calmly. "Furthermore, under Section 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101, commonly known as the Warren Act, your company failed to provide the mandatory 60-day advance written notice before initiating capital freezes that will inevitably trigger mass employee furloughs. By attempting to conceal your liquidity and solvency from your workforce, you and your executive officers have incurred direct personal liability for back pay and civil statutory penalties." Brandon jumped out of his chair, pointing an angry finger at Arthur. "This is extortion. My mother signed a preliminary restructuring term sheet with your firm last month. That document is legally binding." Arthur turned his gaze toward Brandon, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thorn, that preliminary term sheet contained a strict ethical compliance clause. Furthermore, your mother attempted this morning to retroactively alter executive meeting minutes to claim Mr. Vance waived his inspection rights constitutes corporate forgery under state penal statutes. Under the governing legal doctrine, any contract executed or modified under fraudulent misrepresentation is void ab initio. It is completely null and void from its inception as a matter of law." Eleanor sank back into her leather chair, her breathing shallow. "What about our debt maturity?" We have $80 million coming due in 14 days. Arthur pulled a second document from his folder. Vance Capital has acquired 62% of your outstanding senior debt obligations from secondary market holders over the last 12 hours. Under the governing credit agreements, your failure to maintain the $1.3 billion equity buffer constitutes an immediate event of default. We are accelerating the full principal balance. Payment of $80 million is due in full by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. This is a legal execution, Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. It is not an execution, Mrs. Thorne, Arthur replied softly as he closed his portfolio. It is the logical enforcement of contractual law. When your son stomped on Mr. Vance's place card, he did not just disrespect a man. He destroyed the legal foundation of your entire corporate enterprise. While the legal notices were being served, another disaster was unfolding in the finance department. Clara had conducted a deep forensic audit of Thorne Holdings' public filings and private ledgers over the past 6 hours, uncovering severe irregularities. She brought the findings directly to my office. Julian, look at these asset allocation entries from the last 2 fiscal quarters, Clara said, laying out the financial charts. Eleanor Thorne and Brandon Thorne have been systematically transferring corporate capital into private shell accounts. I reviewed the numbers carefully. Over the past 18 months, Eleanor had authorized over $14 million in unapproved management loans to Brandon. Brandon had used those funds to purchase a luxury yacht in Miami, 3 exotic sports cars, and a waterfront penthouse registered under Tiffany's name. This is a textbook case of dissipation of corporate assets and breach of fiduciary duty, I said, looking at Clara. They were using company funds as their personal piggy bank while claiming to shareholders that the firm was expanding. Exactly, Clara confirmed. Under Delaware corporate law, board directors who intentionally dissipate corporate assets for personal enrichment lose all indemnification protections. They are personally liable for every single dollar. I picked up my desk phone and placed a direct call to Lawrence Montgomery, the chairman of the board of Thorne Holdings. Lawrence answered on the first ring, his tone desperate. "Julian, please tell me we can resolve this," Lawrence pleaded. "The stock price is plummeting. We have lost 34% of our market capitalization since the market opened this morning." "Lawrence," I said calmly, "I am holding a forensic audit report that proves Eleanor and Brandon have committed massive corporate asset dissipation and breach of fiduciary duty. If this report is handed to the Securities and Exchange Commission, your entire board will face federal subpoenas by Monday morning." "My God," Lawrence gasped. "What do you want, Julian? What is your condition?" "I want an emergency board meeting convened at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," I answered. "And I want Eleanor Thorne and Brandon Thorne present in that room. I will present my final terms then. If they refuse to attend, I will file the enforcement action in federal court at 9:15. At 9 o'clock the following morning, the atmosphere inside the main executive boardroom of Thorne Holdings was tense enough to break glass. The large mahogany table was surrounded by all 11 members of the board of directors, including Chairman Lawrence Montgomery and Chief Investment Officer Spencer Montgomery. Sitting at the far end of the table were Eleanor Thorne and Brandon Thorne. Eleanor was dressed in a sharp black business suit, attempting to maintain an air of defiance, but the dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed her total lack of sleep. Brandon sat beside her, slump-shouldered, nervously biting his fingernails and staring at the polished wood table. At exactly 9:05, the double doors opened and I walked into the room. Accompanying me were Clara Miller and Arthur Vance. I did not sit at the side of the table. I walked directly to the head of the boardroom, where the chairman's seat was located. Lawrence Montgomery stood up immediately and offered me the seat without hesitation. I sat down, placed my hands flat on the table, and looked around the room. The board members sat in absolute silence, waiting for me to speak. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice calm and measured. "We are here today because Thorne Holdings stands on the absolute precipice of complete financial collapse. As of 9 o'clock this morning, your stock price has dropped 42%. Your senior lenders have accelerated $80 million in debt maturities, and your manufacturing facilities will lose their operating software licenses at midnight tonight. Under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. Eleanor cleared her throat loudly, trying to assert her authority one last time. Mr. Vance, we recognize that errors were made, but this board will not be intimidated into surrendering corporate sovereignty based on a personal dispute that occurred at a social function. I looked at Eleanor with mild pity. Mrs. Thorne, this is not a personal dispute. This is a cold assessment of managerial competence and fiduciary integrity. I gestured to Clara, who distributed bound copies of our forensic audit report to every board member in the room. If you open the documents before you, I continued, you will see documented evidence of systematic asset dissipation. Over the past 18 months, Eleanor Thorne has authorized $14 million in unauthorized corporate loans to her son, Brandon Thorne. Those funds were diverted to purchase luxury real estate and personal assets for Mr. Thorne Associates, in direct violation of your corporate charter and federal securities regulations. The board members began flipping through the pages, their expressions turning from anxiety to pure outrage. "This is outrageous," one senior director shouted, glaring at Eleanor. "You used company capital to buy your son a yacht while telling us we needed credit restructuring? It was a temporary treasury management allocation." Eleanor stammered, her face turning crimson. "It was going to be repaid upon the closing of the capital injection." "Repaid with my money, Mrs. Thorne?" I asked quietly. "You intended to use Vance Capital $1.3 billion investment to cover up your illegal conversion of corporate assets. That is not treasury management. That is corporate fraud." Arthur Vance stepped forward and laid out the legal consequences. Under Delaware corporate law and federal statutes, Eleanor Thorne and Brandon Thorne have committed severe breaches of fiduciary duty. Furthermore, by failing to issue Warren Act notices under Section 29 U.S.C. Section 2101 prior to impending operational halts, executive officers face personal civil liability. Lawrence Montgomery slammed his hand onto the table, looking at Eleanor with undisguised contempt. "Eleanor, you have lied to this board, compromised our financial integrity, and brought this company to its knees to satisfy your son's arrogance." I raised my hand slightly, bringing the room back to order. "Vance Capital is prepared to step in and save Thorne Holdings from immediate bankruptcy," I said. "We are prepared to reinstate the $1.3 billion capital injection, settle the $80 million debt default, and grant long-term software licensing rights to keep your manufacturing facilities fully operational." The board members leaned forward, a collective sigh of relief sweeping through the room, but Spencer Montgomery knew there was a heavy condition attached. "What are your terms, Julian?" Spencer asked softly. "My terms are non-negotiable," I stated firmly. "First, Eleanor Thorne will resign immediately from her position as Chief Executive Officer and surrender her seat on the Board of Directors. She will forfeit all unvested stock options and golden parachute severance packages." Eleanor gasped, jumping to her feet. "Resign? Forfeit my options? I built this company. You cannot strip me of my life work." "You destroyed your life work the moment you traded corporate integrity for personal vanity," replied coldly. "Second," I continued, "Brandon Thorne will be terminated immediately from his position as Vice President of Business Operations with cause. He will be permanently barred from entering any corporate facility owned by Thorne Holdings, and the company will initiate full legal recovery actions to reclaim the $14 million in dissipated assets." Brandon turned white as paper. "Mom," he cried out, his voice cracking, "do something! You cannot let them take everything." Eleanor looked around the boardroom, searching desperately for a single ally among the directors she had worked with for a decade. But every board member turned their gaze away from Eleanor. In the cold reality of corporate finance, loyalty vanishes the instant an executive becomes an unmanageable liability. Third, I concluded, Vance Capital will convert its senior debt holdings into controlling equity, acquiring 51% of the voting shares in Thorne Holdings. We will appoint an interim independent chief executive officer to restructure operations and restore ethical governance. Lawrence Montgomery looked at the board members sitting around the table, All those in favor of accepting Mr. Vance's terms and removing Eleanor Thorne and Brandon Thorne from executive leadership, raise your hand. Every single board member in the room raised their hand immediately. The vote is unanimous, Lawrence declared, his voice echoing in the silent boardroom. Eleanor Thorne, Brandon Thorne, you are hereby relieved of all corporate authority. Security will escort you from the premises immediately. The exit of Eleanor Thorne and Brandon Thorne from Thorne Holdings corporate headquarters was neither quiet nor dignified. As two uniformed security officers escorted them through the main glass lobby, news camera crews and financial journalists were waiting outside on the sidewalk. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing the disgraced former chief executive officer and her son as they pulled their coats tight against the cold wind and rushed into a waiting taxi. The viral video of the gala incident had already amassed over 12 million views online, becoming a national symbol of corporate arrogance met with swift accountability. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Vance Capital issued a formal press release announcing the completed acquisition of controlling equity in Thorne Holdings, the total reinstatement of the $1.3 billion capital pool, and the full settlement of all outstanding debt obligations. Inside the corporate headquarters, the atmosphere transformed almost overnight. Furlough notices were immediately canceled. Manufacturing facilities resumed normal operations under valid software licenses. And employee morale rebounded as transparent governance was established. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I returned to the Plaza Hotel Grand Ballroom. Vance Capital was hosting a charity fundraiser for regional workforce education, bringing together business leaders, community organizers, and industry partners from across the country. Clara Miller walked beside me as we moved through the brightly lit room. The string quartet played gently in the background, and polite conversation filled the air. As we approached the center of the ballroom, I noticed Table 3. The table was set impeccably, with crisp linen napkins, polished silver, and crystal goblets. Directly in front of the head seat was a gold-embossed place card bearing my name, Julian Vance. Clara smiled as she looked at the card. "We could have reserved Table 1 or Table 2 tonight, Julian," she remarked softly. I pulled out the chair and sat down calmly. "Table 3 is just fine, Clara," I replied. "The number on the table does not define who we are. It never did." Later that evening, Spencer Montgomery walked over to Table 3, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. He sat down across from me, his expression thoughtful. "I spoke with Lawrence this morning," Spencer said. "The legal recovery team has already repossessed the yacht and the Miami penthouse that Brandon bought with company funds. Eleanor is facing a formal civil lawsuit from the Independent Shareholder Committee to recover the remaining dissipated assets. They brought it upon themselves." "Spencer," I said quietly, "they believed that wealth gave them the right to treat other people as invisible. They forgot that every empire is built on the fundamental currency of human respect." Spencer nodded slowly. "You know, Brandon still tells people that he lost everything because of a seat at a party." "He is wrong," I said, looking out over the crowded ballroom. "He did not lose everything because of a seat. He lost everything because he believed that sitting in a VIP chair gave him permission to stomp on another human dignity. Money without character is nothing more than a temporary illusion. Life is remarkably similar to a grand gala where everyone is searching for their rightful place at the table. Many people spend their entire lives clawing, stepping on others, and fighting for a seat at Table 3, believing it represents ultimate power, applause, and prestige. But they forget one timeless truth. Your true value is never defined by the chair you sit in, but by how you treat the human beings around you while you are at the top. Never let arrogance blind you into seeing a senior leader as a nobody or a hard-working soul as disposable trash. In the relentless, unbreakable cycle of human consequence, the seat you arrogantly snatch from someone today might just be the trap that strips away everything you hold dear tomorrow. Respect is the only currency that never devalues. When you sit at your table, occupy it with humility, integrity, and grace.